The red dust of Zirian Prime stuck to everything like blood. Sergeant James Washington wiped his visor with a shaking hand, trying to clear the grime that made everything look like a nightmare. Around him, the air cracked and hissed with plasma bolts that could turn a man into vapor in seconds. 3 hours, he muttered to himself, checking his ammo counter. The numbers weren't good. None of this was good. Private Kevin Davis was pressed against a chunk of twisted metal that used to be part of a building. Sweat poured down his dark face as he fired quick bursts at the advancing enemy. "Sarge, I'm down to my last 2 clips." "Make them count," James shouted back, ducking as a plasma bolt seared the air where his head had been a second before. The smell of burned ozone filled his nostrils. To his left, Antonio Rodriguez was doing something with his hands that looked like praying. Maybe it was. On a day like this, James couldn't blame him. The young soldier from Texas had joined up 6 months ago, full of dreams about seeing the galaxy. Now he was learning that the galaxy was mostly interested in killing him. "Contact rear." Damon Thompson called out from behind a crystalline outcrop. The big man from Detroit had the best eyes in the squad, and right now those eyes were wide with fear. More bugs coming in from the south. James felt his stomach drop. The Kythera were like nightmares made real. Giant insects that walked upright, with mandibles that could snap a man in half and claws that could punch through military armor like it was paper. They made clicking sounds when they moved, a sound that would haunt the dreams of any soldier who lived long enough to sleep again. Command had called this a routine patrol. Just a quick sweep through the outer settlements to make sure the civilians had evacuated safely. Nobody mentioned the Kythera hive that had dug in 3 miles underground. Nobody mentioned the dragon ships that had been spotted in the upper atmosphere. And nobody certainly mentioned that the 7th Infantry would be walking into what felt like the end of the world. "Washington, report." The voice in his earpiece belonged to Lieutenant Michael Brooks, safe in his command bunker 20 miles away. "What's your situation?" "Situation is we're about to become bug food, sir," James replied, firing a burst at a Kythera warrior that was getting too close for comfort. The creature shrieked and fell, green blood spraying across the red ground. The battlefield stretched out before them like something from a fever dream. Zirian Prime wasn't supposed to be habitable. The planet was mostly crystal formations and toxic dust, with an atmosphere that would kill you if your suit failed. But humans had found a way to make it work like they always did. They'd built settlements in the crystal caves, mining operations that pulled rare metals from the ground, and even a small spaceport for the cargo ships. Now all of that was gone. The Kythera had swept through like a plague, destroying everything humans had built. The crystal formations were cracked and broken, the settlements were burning ruins, and the spaceport was just a crater filled with melted metal. "Davis, how many rounds you got left?" James asked, popping up to take another shot. "Counting? Maybe 30 rounds, Sarge. After that, I'm throwing rocks." James almost smiled at that. Davis was from Chicago, grew up in neighborhoods where throwing rocks at the enemy was sometimes the only option. The kid had never complained, never asked why a poor black kid from the South Side was fighting aliens on a planet whose name he couldn't even pronounce 6 months ago. Rodriguez suddenly stopped his muttered prayers. "Sarge, look at that." He was pointing toward a crashed ship about 200 meters away. The ship was huge, with organic curves that marked it as draconic design. Smoke was rising from its broken hull, and pieces of it were scattered across the crystalline ground. But that wasn't what made James's blood run cold. Next to the wreckage, something small was moving. Something with golden scales that caught the alien sunlight like scattered coins. "Is that what I think it is?" Thompson asked, his deep voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. James raised his binoculars and felt his breath catch in his throat. Was a dragon. Not one of the massive war beasts that commanded the draconic fleets, but something small. Baby. The creature was no bigger than a human child, lying on its side in the toxic dust. Even from this distance, James could see the dark stain of blood spreading beneath those beautiful golden scales. The dragon was dying, alone on a battlefield that cared nothing for its young life. James stared at the dying dragon through his binoculars, his finger frozen on the trigger of his rifle. Around him, the battle raged like hell had opened up and spilled onto the crystalline plains of Zirian Prime. But all he could see was that small golden creature bleeding into the alien dust. "Sarge, what are you doing?" Davis yelled, noticing that James had stopped firing. "We got bugs closing in from the east." But James was already moving. He slung his rifle across his back and started running toward the crashed dragon ship. His boots crunched on the crystal fragments scattered across the ground, each step taking him further from his squad and deeper into danger. "Washington, get back here," Rodriguez shouted. That's suicide. Maybe it was. James had been fighting aliens for 2 years now. He'd seen things that would give normal people nightmares for the rest of their lives. He'd watched good soldiers die screaming, torn apart by Kythera claws or burned alive by dragon fire. War had taught him that mercy was a luxury most soldiers couldn't afford. But something about that small, helpless creature made him remember who he used to be before the war. Before he'd learned to kill without thinking. Before he'd started seeing enemies instead of living beings. The dragon was even smaller up close. Its golden scales were dulled with pain and covered in a thick, dark fluid that James realized was blood. The creature's breathing was shallow and quick, like a bird with a broken wing. When it saw James approaching, its amber eyes went wide with fear. For a moment they just stared at each other. Human and dragon. Natural enemies in a war that neither of them had started. James could hear his squad calling for him over the comm, could hear the clicking sounds of Kythera warriors getting closer. But all of that seemed far away now. "Easy there, little one," James said softly, kneeling beside the wounded dragon. His voice was gentle, the same tone he'd used with stray dogs back home in Atlanta. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon tried to move away, but it was too weak. A soft whimper escaped its throat, a sound so human-like that James felt something twist in his chest. He'd heard soldiers make that same sound when they were dying far from home. James pulled out his field medic kit with steady hands. The war had taught him how to patch up wounded humans, but dragon anatomy was different. Still, blood was blood and wounds were wounds. The basics were the same. "Washington, what the hell are you doing?" Lieutenant Brooks' voice crackled through his earpiece. "Fall back to extraction point immediately." James reached up and switched off his comm for the first time in 2 years. He was going to disobey a direct order. And it felt right. The dragon's wound was deep, running along its left side where shrapnel from the crash had torn through the delicate scales. James worked quickly, cleaning the area with antiseptic that made the small creature hiss in pain. But it didn't try to bite him or scratch him with its tiny claws. Instead, those intelligent amber eyes watched his every move. "That's it," James murmured as he applied pressure bandages. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" Behind him he could hear his squad laying down covering fire. Davis was shouting something about ammunition. Thompson was cursing in a steady stream. Rodriguez was back to praying, but louder now. They were buying him time with their lives, and James knew it. The dragon's breathing began to steady as James worked. The bleeding slowed, then stopped completely. Those amber eyes never left his face, and James had the strangest feeling that the creature was trying to tell him something. "You understand me, don't you?" he asked quietly. "You know I'm trying to help." As if in answer, the dragon lifted one small claw and gently touched James's armored glove. The touch was soft, careful, like a child reaching for comfort. In that moment, James felt something he hadn't experienced since the war began. "Oh, Sarge." Davis's voice was desperate now. "The bugs are breaking through. We can't hold them much longer." James looked back at his squad, then down at the dragon. The creature was still weak, still vulnerable. If he left now, the Kythera would find it within minutes. They'd tear it apart without a second thought, the way they tore apart everything else. But if he stayed, his squad might die trying to protect him. Good men who'd followed him through 2 years of hell. Men who trusted him to make the right choices. The dragon seemed to sense his conflict. It made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and those ancient eyes closed for a moment. When they opened again, there was something new in them. Not just trust, but understanding. This small creature somehow knew exactly what James was risking for its life. "Hold the line," James said into his comm, switching it back on. His voice was quiet but firm. "We're not leaving without him." The small dragon's eyes began to glow with a soft golden light as James finished bandaging its wounds. At first, he thought it was just the alien sun reflecting off those amber irises, but then he realized something impossible was happening. The creature was looking directly into his mind. Images flooded James's consciousness like a river of light. He saw vast underground tunnels filled with clicking, chittering sounds. Massive chambers where thousands of Kythera warriors slept in perfect rows. And at the center of it all, pulsing nodes of organic machinery that controlled the entire hive like a giant brain. "What the hell?" James gasped, pressing his hands to his temples as the visions continued. The dragon was showing him things no human had ever seen before. Secret pathways through the Kythera network. Weak points in their command structure. Ways to turn their own hive mind against them. The dragon made a soft chirping sound, and suddenly James could understand it. Not words exactly, but meaning flowing directly from one mind to another. "The nodes," the dragon's voice whispered inside his head, young and frightened but determined. "They connect everything. Break the connections, break the swarm. James stared at the small creature in amazement. This wasn't just some animal caught in the crossfire. This was intelligence. Ancient wisdom trapped in a body that couldn't weigh more than 50 pounds. Rodriguez. James called out to his communications specialist. Get me a channel to both human and dragon command frequencies. Now. Sarge, that's impossible, Rodriguez replied, ducking behind cover as plasma bolts seared the air above him. Dragons don't share their military frequencies with humans. We're enemies, remember? Not anymore, we're not, James said firmly. He looked down at the dragon who was trying to stand on shaky legs. What's your name, little one? The answer came as a feeling rather than words. Fire. Light. The first spark that ignites a flame. James smiled despite everything happening around them. Blaze, he said aloud. Your name is Blaze. The dragon's eyes brightened, and for the first time since James had found him, the creature seemed to relax completely. Trust flowed between them like electricity, and suddenly James understood that this wasn't just about saving one small life anymore. This was about changing everything. Blaze pressed his tiny claws against the crystalline ground and began to hum. The sound was barely audible over the battle, but James felt it vibrating through his bones. Around them, the broken pieces of the dragon ship began to glow with the same golden light as Blaze's eyes. Holy shit, Thompson whispered from his position behind the crystal outcrop. Sarge, the ship's coming back online. The crashed vessel's systems hummed to life, creating a shimmering barrier of energy around their position. Kythera plasma bolts struck the shield and scattered like water hitting a window. For the first time in hours, James's squad had real cover. This is Sergeant James Washington, 7th Infantry. James spoke into his comm as Rodriguez worked frantically to establish the impossible connection Blaze had somehow made possible. I've got critical intelligence on Kythera hive structures. Transmitting to all forces in the area. The dragon closed his eyes and the images flowed again, this time through the communication channels to every human and dragon commander within 50 miles. James watched his own display screen fill with tactical data that would have taken months of reconnaissance to gather. Confirmed receipt, came a voice James had never heard before. Deep, ancient, speaking perfect galactic standard with an accent that sounded like distant thunder. This is Wing Commander Pyraxis of the Draconic Third Fleet. How did you obtain this information, human? James looked down at Blaze, who was now standing steadily despite his bandaged wounds. The small dragon gave what James could only describe as an encouraging nod. I had help from one of yours, Commander. A young dragon who wanted to save lives instead of taking them. There was a long pause on the channel. When the dragon commander spoke again, his voice carried a note of wonder. Impossible. You speak of cooperation between our species. Such a thing has never occurred in galactic history. Well, Davis called out, grinning as he watched Kythera warriors bouncing harmlessly off their new energy shield, there's a first time for everything. Above them, the sky suddenly filled with ships. Human fighters flying in formation with massive dragons, their combined firepower turning the tide of battle in minutes. James watched in amazement as natural enemies worked together with deadly precision, all because one small creature had chosen trust over fear. Blaze chirped softly and rubbed against James's leg like an oversized cat. Through their mental connection, James felt the dragon's satisfaction and something else. Pride. Not in the destruction happening around them, but in the cooperation they had made possible. You know what, little guy? James said, scratching gently behind Blaze's neck ridges. I think this is the beginning of something pretty amazing. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the war began, James Washington believed they might actually win it. The battlefield transformed before James's eyes as dragons and humans fought side by side for the first time in galactic history. What had started as a desperate last stand was becoming something that would be talked about for generations. Dragon Flight Talon 7, this is Ground Team Washington. James spoke into his comm, still amazed that he was coordinating strikes with creatures that had been trying to kill him just hours ago. We've got a cluster of hive nodes at grid reference 4-7 alpha. Blaze says they're critical to the network. Above them, massive dragons wheeled through the alien sky alongside human fighters. Their combined attack was devastating. Dragon fire turned Kythera positions into glass while human precision missiles struck exactly where Blaze's intelligence indicated the most damage could be done. Direct hit on primary node, came the reply from Wing Commander Pyraxis, his ancient voice now carrying a note of respect. The small one's information is flawless. How does he know these things? James looked down at Blaze, who was sitting beside him like a golden-scaled dog, his amber eyes watching the battle with intense concentration. The young dragon had grown stronger as the fighting continued, as if being useful was giving him strength. Dragons are connected to all living things, Blaze's voice whispered in James's mind. We feel the pain of the hive. The wrongness of it. It hurts to exist. That made sense in a way that human logic couldn't quite grasp. Dragons were ancient creatures older than human civilization. They probably understood life and death in ways that soldiers like James never could. Thompson, Davis, Rodriguez. James called to his squad. We're moving to support the advance on the secondary hive entrance. Stay close and watch each other's backs. His men moved with the smooth efficiency of soldiers who'd been through hell together. Davis had found extra ammunition somewhere and was back to his usual wisecracking self. Rodriguez had stopped praying and started singing something in Spanish under his breath. Thompson was just Thompson, steady as a rock and twice as reliable. But as they advanced across the crystal-strewn battlefield, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. The Kythera weren't retreating. They were regrouping, pulling back toward a massive crystal formation that pulsed with sickly green light. That's the main hive node, Blaze said, his mental voice suddenly urgent. If they reach it, they can call reinforcements from other worlds. Thousands of warriors. Too many to fight. James saw the trap immediately. The Kythera had been willing to sacrifice their outer positions to draw the combined human-dragon forces into range of their most powerful weapons. Smart. Deadly smart. All units fall back. James shouted into his comm, it's a trap. They're drawing us into a kill zone. But it was too late. The green crystal began to pulse faster, and the ground beneath their feet started to vibrate. Somewhere deep underground, something massive was waking up. Can't retreat now, Sarge, Davis said, checking his rifle. If that thing calls for backup, we're all dead anyway. He was right. James could see it in the faces of his men, in the determined flight patterns of the dragons above them. This was their one chance to end the threat before it became unstoppable. Blaze, James said quietly, can you get us close to that crystal? The young dragon looked up at him with those ancient amber eyes, and James felt a wave of determination that wasn't entirely his own. Yes, but it will be dangerous. The hive will defend itself. Everything's dangerous, Thompson said with a grin. That's what makes it interesting. They moved as one unit across the battlefield, human soldiers and one small dragon working together like they'd trained for years instead of hours. Blaze used his connection to the dragon ship systems to provide cover while James's squad laid down suppressing fire that kept the Kythera from organizing a proper defense. But as they got closer to the pulsing crystal, the enemy resistance became desperate. Kythera warriors threw themselves at the advancing forces with no regard for their own lives, their only goal to protect the hive node. That's when James saw the massive Kythera queen rising from the crystal formation like a nightmare made real. She was 10 feet tall, with razor-sharp claws that could cut through armor like paper and mandibles that dripped with acid. Her eyes glowed with the same sickly green light as the hive node, and when she screamed, the sound made James's bones ache. She was heading straight for Blaze. No. James threw himself between the queen and the small dragon, his rifle blazing as he emptied his entire clip into the creature's armored hide. The bullets barely slowed her down. The queen's claws caught him across the chest, tearing through his armor like tissue paper. James felt himself flying through the air, his vision going dark around the edges as pain exploded through his entire body. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was golden fire erupting from Blaze's small form, brighter than the alien sun. James woke up in a medical bay that looked nothing like any human hospital he'd ever seen. The walls curved in organic patterns, and soft golden light seemed to come from the ceiling itself. His chest was wrapped in bandages that felt warm against his skin, and for the first time in weeks he wasn't in pain. "You're awake," came a familiar voice in his mind. James turned his head and smiled at the sight of Blaze curled up on a chair beside his bed. The young dragon had grown during the 3 months James had been recovering. His golden scales now shimmered with health, and his amber eyes held a confidence that hadn't been there on the battlefield. "How long was I out?" James asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. 12 weeks. The queen's claws carried poison. Dragon healers and human doctors had to work together to save you. Blaze's mental voice carried warmth and relief. "I was worried you wouldn't wake up." James sat up carefully, testing his range of motion. Everything seemed to work, though he could see new scars crisscrossing his chest and arms. Battle souvenirs that would remind him of Zirian Prime for the rest of his life. "What happened after I went down?" he asked. Blaze's eyes brightened with something that looked like pride. The golden fire you saw was more than just flame. It was a signal, calling every dragon in the sector to our location. When they saw a human willing to die protecting one of their young, everything changed. Through the curved window beside his bed, James could see something that would have been impossible just months ago. Human and dragon children playing together in a vast courtyard, their laughter echoing off crystalline walls. Young people who would grow up seeing cooperation instead of war as the natural order of things. "Welcome to Unity Station," Blaze said, following his gaze. "The first joint human-dragon colony in galactic history." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Admiral Patricia Hayes entered, followed by a massive dragon whose scales were deep blue shot through with silver. The dragon had to duck to fit through the doorway, but his movements were graceful despite his size. "Sergeant Washington," Admiral Hayes said with a smile. "It's good to see you back on your feet. I'd like you to meet High Commander Draconius of the Dragon Council." The great dragon inclined his head in what James recognized as a formal greeting. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, but there was warmth in it. "The human who saved our young and showed us a new path. Your actions on Zirion Prime have changed the course of galactic history, James Washington." James felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I just did what felt right, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Draconius replied seriously. "Not anyone. Your species has a gift for seeing individuals where others see only enemies. This is why the Council has voted to propose something unprecedented." Admiral Hayes stepped forward, her expression serious but hopeful. "The Dragon Council wants to establish a joint military academy. Humans and dragons training together, learning from each other's strengths. They've asked specifically for you to help design the curriculum." James looked at Blaze, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "You knew about this, didn't you?" "I may have suggested that the human who saved me would be the perfect choice to train others in the art of cooperation," Blaze admitted, his mental voice carrying amusement. Over the following weeks, James threw himself into the work of building something entirely new. The academy would train mixed units of humans and dragons, teaching them to fight not just alongside each other, but as one integrated force. He worked with Davis, who had been promoted to instructor after showing remarkable skill at communicating with young dragons. Rodriguez had discovered an unexpected talent for understanding dragon technology, bridging the gap between human engineering and draconic mysticism. Thompson had become the Academy's head of tactical training, his steady presence perfect for calming nervous recruits from both species. But it was James's partnership with Blaze that became the model for everything they were trying to achieve. The young dragon had grown into his role as the first dragon ambassador to human space, but he never forgot the moment of trust that had started it all. Standing in the Academy's main training hall, James watched human and dragon cadets work through combat exercises that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. Young people who would never know the fear and hatred that had defined the early years of the war. "You know what the best part is?" Blaze asked, settling beside James to watch the training session. "What's that?" "None of these kids think what we're doing is strange. To them, this is just how things are. Humans and dragons working together, protecting each other, building something better than either species could create alone." James smiled, remembering that moment on the battlefield when he'd first looked into Blaze's amber eyes and seen not an enemy, but a person worth saving. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness really could change the galaxy. "Come on, partner," he said, standing up and checking his lesson plan. "We've got a new batch of recruits to train."